All right, so this is the sordid tale of customer identifiers across organizations, and I'm calling it that because really doing customer identifiers or tracking a customer is actually pretty complicated when you have a multi-level organization, and I don't mean like marketing, I mean like a multi-level organization, or you have third-party partners or anything like that. So I'm going to tell you that in the real world, identifying people and keeping track of that just isn't pretty. So let's just talk about this a little bit. So for most of this, we're going to work as if we have a corporation. I think I spelled that right. With a corporation ID, and then we have some other entities, and those could be other companies, they could be apps, whatever it is. You could be third-party data. We'll talk about it a little bit more. And those entities can either use the corporate ID or they can have their own ID. And we'll talk about why a single corporate ID may or may not be a good idea. And a friend of mine who really understands this better than me will probably leave a bunch of comments. So we'll see how that works out. So essentially, if we do this, we have corporate and we have my identifiers in like the third parties or down in the divisions. Those are essentially also known as, right? It's, hey, I have this person at this level and I have these other people at this other level. And so that's sort of an also known as. They all point to the same person, but because they may end up looking like different people to us for a while, we'll call them an also known as. And sometimes we'll change who we think that is, and it'll become a formally known as. So why is this hard? This is actually the important part. What we know about a person changes. And so that means that who we think that person is might change. And we may have different divisions, especially if we don't have an authenticated person or we're gathering data about somebody or a company, right? Could be any. When we say person, it could be a corp person too, right? What we know about that person changes over time, and so who we think that person is might change over time, and so we may end up with a couple people that may be the same person or one person that's actually a couple person, especially in a lot of situations. Fraud's another one though. And what we learn may mean that person is someone else. As we gather data about that person or gather their demographic info, what that basically may mean that we find out there's something else. Another reason this is hard is your company may purchase other companies, or you may acquire data from somewhere else, and the data comes with its own identifiers, and it will have that own identifier over time. If you buy a company or you merge, you could apply your identifier, but for some period of years, that won't actually line up, and so you're going to have to figure out some way to deal with that situation. Another problem with a single identifier for a person across multiple companies is you have a security blast radius a little bit, right? If I have an identifier, I can use that identifier everywhere. We might want to scope identifiers to reduce the blast radius and reduce the control footprint for that. And another thing that might happen is we might go through fraud analysis and realize, hey, we think this is this person in this transaction who's another person that's already a customer of ours, and it may turn out that's a fraud. That's no longer that person. So we really would like that person to have a new identity and tag all the fraudulent transactions with that identity, maybe. And then we might want to link that back to the other. So this is where it gets complicated. So let's talk about this a little bit, right? And let me just give you an example here. I'm going to use this example throughout the whole talk. So I got a corporation. It's got two divisions. Each division's got two apps. You can see I'm like a super binary person. Is that right? 0 and 1. I guess I'm not binary. Anyway, whatever that means. And then I got two partners, and I bought a company, and the other company's got two apps, right? So when I buy a company, they're going to have their own identifiers. If I want to link those people together, I got to find some way to do it before all the systems are migrated. Or I can just wait. And then the partners, we're going to have their own IDs no matter what. They're not going to change their identifier for a person to my identifier. So if I want to link those partner people to myself, then I might need to do something different. So let's take the same diagram we had before, and we're going to have our corporation with two divisions, each with two apps, and in this case I only did one partner because I didn't have space in the screen. So one of the ways we can do this is we can do central IDs. I'm going to call this option 1. We can push a corporation ID across ourselves, down to the corporation, down to the divisions, and down into the apps. If we control all that, but man, with the partner, I'm still broken. And what this basically means is we would come up with a different strategy potentially for partners where they would have whatever their identifier, and maybe they would link or keep a copy of my corp identifier. So another way we could do this is we can do Conway's IDs. I was calling this because it's like Conway's Law version 2 here. And you can see that in this case, all of the divisions each have their own ID, and the corporation has an ID for that, and the partner still got an ID for that. And so in this case, and I called this Conway's, right, because basically each division has its own ID, but the corporation in that case would actually have 2 IDs. Oh, look, it's got a partner ID too, but we gave it a corporate ID for that person. And so then you just got to figure out what that means. And then this is, I was calling this, I was joking, this is corporate ID full throttle, right? This is like this is Conway's Law, the big one. And that's, you see this too sometimes, where even individual apps will have a current local, some kind of identifier, in-system identifier. And that may be created temporarily in theirs to run standalone, or it could have been a purchased app. Purchased apps have their own identifiers, right? And so suddenly I've actually got 3 tiers of identifiers for my internal, and I've got 1 partner level, and I don't know what I'm going to do to that, and I want to bind them all together. So like I said, we could go back to option 1, but the way these things pop up, a lot of times you're going to end up with an option 2 or an option 3 here. So if we look at option 2A, right? So this is where we have the divisions did the right thing, sort of. They've got their own identifiers. I've got a corporation, and then I've got 2 divisions and the partner. What I could do is I can actually import the division IDs and the partner ID and bind them to the corporate ID and the corporate identity catalog, right? And so this is kind of cool. We basically just let all the other units run by themselves, and no big deal. And then we bind it back to the corporate identifier. And that way, when we're in the data warehouse or other places, we can tie these people together, versions of the same person together. And in that case, that might work pretty well, but then everybody's got to be aware kind of how these corporate IDs actually bind people together. So this is kind of cool too, because if it turns out that Division 2 thought it was that corporate ID, and then it turned out Division 2 figured out as it gathered more data, it was that person's evil twin living in the same house, right? And I have nothing against twins. Anyway, an evil twin living in the house, or a good twin, then we might actually need to tear that apart, right? Like Division 1 and Division 2 might actually have 2 different people because they're twins at the same address with the same birth date, blah, 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 right? Which becomes hard to divine. So that's what this one is. This is 2A, and the option here is to just pull everybody to the corporate. The reverse version of that is we basically have all the divisions hold the corporate ID. We have a corporate ID for a person at the macro level. All the divisions and apps end up knowing that that corporate ID is bound to the division or partner ID. And then when anything goes to the data lake, the divisions are responsible for keeping track of the binding, right? So in this case, we push the binding between the corporate identifier and all the kind of divisional identifiers. We push that down into the divisions, and the corporation only knows that it's got a corp ID, and then it's each division's job to make sure that all the division data has both. And and this works for partner too, right? The partner keeps track of our corporate ID, and whenever we do an interaction with them, whenever a division does an interaction with the corporate entities, or it's got to bridge through corporate to another division, they would provide the corporate ID and not the division ID, right? So the other one we talked about was version 3. In this case, 3A, so in 2, we actually took the corporate ID and we pushed it down into the divisions, right? In 2A, we brought the division IDs up to the corporation. In 2B, we take the corp IDs down to the division, right? And so those are kind of the inverse of each other. And then another option here, and really it's up to you how you want to manage this, is in this case, so what's the weakness of this approach? The weakness in this approach is if it turns out the corp ID gets split or joined, or we find out that that corp ID is bound to too many people that aren't the same person or whatever, then we have to push that corp ID change to all the divisions, right? So this is that blast radius of change thing. You just got to figure out. So in this case, if it turned out Division 1 and Division 2 that thought they were the same person aren't, they would have to go back to the corporation, get a different corporation binding, and they could manage that. And so the inverse of that is actually we create a custom corp ID for each one of the IDs down in the division and the partner. Why would we do that? We created a level of decoupling, right? So we have the corporate ID, we've got the divisional IDs, we've got the partner ID. And then we want to build a binding between that corporation and those divisions or partner IDs. We might not want to expose the corp ID or the divisions directly to each other, so instead we create joining IDs, right? And so we have a Corp 1, Corp D1, Division 1 ID, a Corp D2, and so each one of those gets pushed down in the division. And I think that's kind of cool. In some ways I think it's complicated, but what it means is if you are going to identify somebody as the same person, then unidentify them across divisions as the same person, or you've got multiple partners and it turned out you got confused who that person was, then this level of decoupling means it's really only the join data that needs to change, and Division 1 and Division 2 would run off their own IDs, and partner would run off their own ID, and the corporation at the corp level would run off their corp ID, and then we create these foreign key joins basically for that. So there's another one of those. So instead of the corporation, so in this case, the corporation actually created the ID and it pushed it down to the divisions. You've got the reverse of this, which is the division's own creating the indirect key, the join key basically, between themselves. Partner could do this too. And so the corporate catalog, instead of having corporate issued IDs for each of the divisions and partners, the corporate catalog would actually have parent IDs that were created by the divisions and partners. So in the other one, the corporation created the keys and pushed them down. In this one, each of the divisions creates a key and pushes it up, right? So that's that, right? Let's go back one more time. I just want to say that in the first one, we didn't create any indirection IDs. We basically, in the 2A, we carry the division IDs into the corporation. If the divisions make any changes on their own that bind to a different corp ID, they'll tell the corporation and they'll get a new mapping for that, and this works for partners. 2B was the inverse. We push the corporation IDs down into the division, so we still have a one-to-one binding. Remember, the kind of like version 0 of this, or version 1 was we just use the corp ID for everything. In this case, we have the option of taking a corp ID, pushing it down into the division. Anytime there's a remapping that needs to be done or some other kind of thing, the corporation will coordinate with that divisions or the partners. This still has the advantage that if a division 2 person and a partner we decided were the same person or not, all we have to do is tweak the corporate IDs. So in 3, we actually created an indirection identifier. In the previous ones, we joined the division and the corp together with one ID or the other. In this one, we create joint IDs. The corporation owns them. This has the advantage that the corporation can manage it. The divisions basically just pick this up. And we had the inverse, which is the divisions and the partner actually generate the ID. So in this case, the corporation's not in control. This is kind of a decentralized one, and it's the job of the divisions and the partners to go register their IDs with the corporation. So, and that means I hit the end of the presentation, and I forgot to put in a final slide. Dang it. Oh well.